Hello guys, this is Christian. In my new video I'm gonna reveal you my own chess repertoire in Sicilian Yugoslav Attack. This is, I think, the strongest opening you can play against the Sicilian Dragon. Please lean back and enjoy. Sicilian Dragon rises after the following moves: pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, pawn to d6, we have d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight to f6 attacking the e4, we have knight to c3 defending, then g6 and bishop to e3. Here it comes to mind that he can play knight to g4, but this is a big mistake for black because bishop to b5 check, knight to c6, knight captures, pawn captures, and bishop takes with check. And after bishop d7, we are just a healthy exchange up, and this early in the opening. So knight to g4, at move number 6 is not possible for black. That's the reason why the main move is bishop to g7. And now he can play sooner or later knight to g4. We don't want to allow our opponent this, so we play pawn to f3. Okay, then we have castle on the king side, queen to d2, knight to c6, and then we have bishop to c4. And this bishop to c4, I think, is the strongest variation you can play. Because if you don't play now bishop to c4, instead many players are castling immediately, but then he can strike in the center with pawn to d5. And he has, I think, a better game, a more open game, and that's not what we want. We want to crush our opponent on the king side, and we want to do this very calm and without any aggressive counterplay. And that's the reason why now the move bishop to c4 is so important. We don't want to allow the counterplay with pawn to d5. So very, very important. And I think this is the strongest variation you can play in the Yugoslav attack. Okay. That was enough. So now we have the next standard moves. We have bishop to the d7, we have castle on the queen side, and we have rook to c8. So sooner or later this rook want to capture the bishop on c4. That's the sign to retreat the bishop to the b3. And here are very much options for black how to play the Sicilian Dragon. And I played the Sicilian Dragon by myself for a couple of years, so I think I know the most and the most critical variations for white. And I found out that white can manage all of these variations very, very good. And it is so hard to find some good ways to play for black. Now you can see this. The first line we have a look is the main line, which is very often played after knight to e5. At first, we should finish our castling with king to b1, and then we have knight to c4, and of course we have to take this knight, because our dark square bishop is very important. So bishop takes, rook takes, and we can start our kingside attack with pawn to g4. And here we have a few choices for black, maybe rook to e8, or the more aggressive variation with pawn to b5 immediately. And that's the variation we're gonna have a look for, because it is very aggressive. And the thing you have to know is this pawn on b5 is poisoned. You cannot take this pawn. If you do this, you are opening some files, the b5 especially here, and later on he can sacrifice the knight on e4, and there are so many threats on it. So don't capture it. Another line, which is, I think is the main move here, pawn to b3, but I don't like this move too much because the black squares are very weak and the king is will be quite open. I show you a few moves, maybe you can understand why I don't like it. So maybe we have this move, he sacrifices the rook, we can capture the rook, he takes the knight, queen takes, and then it's open here. So I play very fast a few moves, you can see how things can go here. And if you look at this position, so this is very open. You can go wrong very quickly, and that's not what we want as a white player to play a risky game. We want to have an advantage and want to have an easy plan. So that's the reason why I don't recommend pawn to b3 to you. I recommend pawn to h4, because now we have an immediately a threat and a very dangerous line. The funny thing in this variation is he has to stop pawn to h5. Because if he allows this, this is completely collapsing for black. I show you why. Because maybe he tries to attack by himself, which seems to be possible. But now he allows pawn to h5. And you see the next moves, how the position is collapsing. So we have pawn to b4, knight retreat. It is, I would say, about 90% of the games better to retreat the knight on e2 because it is defending the other knight, and you can also go to d square and to remove the defender of the h5. So you can remember this. If this knight on c3 is attacked by a pawn, maybe it's better to retreat to the e2. Okay? Then maybe he wants to make his own attack, but this is much too slow. Now we can simply exchange up the bishops, especially when the knight is defending our other knight on d4. Then we have pawn to b3, c takes on b3, a takes on b3, and now we don't have to recapture because we don't care about pawn captures on a2. So we can simply capture on g6 and open up the h-file. Then maybe he can take this pawn, but then we can simply go to a1 and our king is more than safe. Then we have f captures, and then we simply can capture the bishop, king takes, queen to h6 check, and king to g8. You can see the only defender of the h7 is the knight on f6, so you can remove it with pawn to g5. Then the knight tries to block in, but we don't care about that because we wanna so sacrifice our rook. And after pawn captures, we play pawn to g6, and nothing is gonna stop our attack. So he has to defend the pawn on h7, and this cannot really be because the only way is to play rook to the f7. We can capture the rook with check, and after king takes, queen h7 check, and this, I don't have to tell you more about it, this is completely losing for black. So that was the reason why he has to play h5 by himself. Here, pawn to h4, and now he has on move 15, he has to play pawn to h5. Here is the next question. What can we play to crush now our opponent's king side? The answer is g takes on h5, knight takes on h5. And actually here we have a very concrete and infecting plan with rook g1, rook g5, and sacrificing the rook against the h5 knight. And then we have our opponent's king side, and then it is over. I show you that. Rook g1. Then we have a counter attack from black. He has to do something, of course. And when the knight is attacked, I said, the stronger, the better square is knight to e2, defending the other knight and also preventing the move knight to f4 later on. Then black can play e6 maybe. And then we have that what we say, rook to g5. And here I show you the lines why black is completely lost now. Actually, in this position, it is very hard to decide the right moves for black. The logical moves are, for example, bishop to f6 or bishop to h6. But both of them leads to complete disaster. Maybe bishop to f6, and then we can simply sacrifice the rook on h5, and after pawn captures, knight to f4, now the game is completely over, I can say. At first it seems like black is winning a piece with pawn to e5, but that is not really true. I'll show you that in the next few moves. I make it a little bit more quickly. So we have knight captures, pawn captures, rook gives this check, king h7, then we're placing the bishop on g5, then maybe rook here, queen captures, check, and so on. We win. At the end of the day, we win the rook on c4, and also black's king is completely open, and this is losing. But what else can be tried by black? So we saw that bishop f6 or h6 is very bad because you can sacrifice the rook. And what else can he play? Retreating the knight to the f6 is very bad because we play pawn to h5, and we have, I think, the same story. So this is very bad. Okay, maybe he can play the popular move, which is rook to c5. Rook to c5 is a popular square in the Sicilian Dragon for black, but actually here it's too late for this move. Because we can sacrifice the knight on e6, and he cannot take the rook because the queen is hanging. And so he has to forcefully capture the knight, but then we can simply take the rook, and he cannot recapture with the pawn because the queen is hanging. So this is completely losing also. So you can see how hard this attack is to defend. At least we have a look at the computer variation. The best move in this position is rook to e8, but this doesn't help black anyways, because we can also sacrifice the rook on h5, and after pawn takes, rook to g1, pinning down the bishop, and your opponent can play the best move, maybe king to h8, but then we have knight to f4, bringing both knights into your attack. The most logical move, pawn to e5, then we just capture the pawn with the knight, and after pawn takes, we should not care about this knight, because now bishop to g5 works. You will see that why. If he blocks with the f6 pawn, we just can capture with the bishop, and after bishop takes, for example, we have checkmate with queen to h6. So very cute checkmate. The next line where we're gonna have a look at is, I think, a very popular line, knight captures on d4. This is the most aggressive line in Sicilian Dragon for black, I think. I know this exactly because I played this by myself and I love this line as black. And here I show you a very tricky line against this. After knight takes on d4, we have bishop takes on d4, and the sense of this opening is after the knight on d4 is removed, it's allowed to play pawn to b5 for black. And this pawn on b5 now is protected by the bishop and only one time attacked by the knight on c3. So that's the big question. How can we play as a white player? It's much too slow to castle now on the king side, because now pawn to a4-5 is much too aggressive for the white ones. So it's not allowed to play slowly in these lines. So at first I asked the computer what he will do. Computer, Stockfish, wanna take the pawn on a7. And the other move Stockfish likes also is knight to d5. I think both of the moves are correct, but I think it's not at first not tricky to play. And also, if you capture the pawn on a7, black has a lot of options to place the rook on the a8, keep pressure on the a file, keep pressure on the c file also, play queen a5 and push pawn to b4. And I think white is facing some difficult positions and problems. So I don't like this Stockfish move bishop takes on a7. And I also think the move knight to d5 is it's a solid move, but you have to play correctly, and it's a slow game and not really a tricky line. I'll show you a few moves. After a knight captures, we have bishop takes on g7, and then king takes, pawn takes, and both players has their chances to win this game, but I think it's quite an equal game with a slight advantage for white. But I have a more tricky line for you. I have found out a more tricky line. I think the players don't know this line, so it's more than dangerous. And the line we're gonna have a look for is our own line with pawn to h4. And this is super aggressive. Okay, now we have to think for black. I think the two obvious choices for black are, at first, push pawn to a5 and create a counterattack, or he plays the stopper move, the stunner move in Sicilian Dragon with pawn to h5. But both of them leads to very, very critical and very sharp positions, which I'm gonna show you now. After pawn to h5, as white, we know exactly what we want and what we're gonna do now. Because now we can simply push pawn to g4. And he cannot really capture pawn takes on g4, maybe h takes on g4. We can simply run with the h pawn, pawn to h5, and we're gonna create a very deadly attack against black's king. So he cannot really take the pawn on g4. On the other hand, he can try to make some counterattack with pawn to a5. But now we have a very easy plan and an easy game. We have to know that the bishop on b3 is not really important now, because to push pawn to a4 is now much too slow for black, and it's so hard to find some counterattack for black. That's why I love the variation. So I show you how we're gonna play. G captures on h5, and we have knight captures on h5. And like in the lines before, we simply have to play rook to g1, then rook to g5, and we're gonna sacrifice the rook against the knight on h5. And then everything is open, and we make boom boom and checkmate black's king. Okay, I show you how a game can continue. Now maybe we have king to h7 because of the fork of rook captures on g6. f7 pawn is pinned by the bishop on b3. So king h7 is the best move. And then we have bishop captures and we have king takes. Because if we don't capture with the bishop after rook to g5, you can play bishop on h6. This is not really good. So that's the reason why we have to capture the bishop, the good defender, the strong defender in black's camp. After that, after king goes back, then we have rook to g5. That's the best and the strongest square for the rook on the g file, because we can now sacrifice the rook against the knight. Okay, so we have maybe rook to h8, defending the knight, but we can now capture this pawn, and we are a healthy pawn up. And this is a very common game, I think, for white, and white is doing much better here. So maybe if he plays not rook to h8 and push this pawn to a4, and so he wants to trap the bishop on b3, but we don't care about this. We can simply sacrifice the rook on h5, and after pawn captures, rook on the g1 check, and after now queen to g5 or h6, this is completely winning for white. Let's go back into move number 13, where black has to make the big decision. We saw that pawn to h5 is much too slow because we have immediately the pawn contact with pawn to g4. So now we look at the stronger move for black, which is pawn to a5. Now again in this position, I ask Stockfish how should I continue. And the move by Stockfish is pawn to a3. But if I played a few games with pawn to a3, I found out that there are a lot of tricks for black, and that can be very dangerous for white also. And it's not really a tricky game for black, because now white needs a little time to create an attack. So I don't like Stockfish's move pawn to a3. I like the more aggressive move. I found out that pushing pawn to h5 is more than dangerous, and it's not really easy to find the right moves for black. The most obvious choices are pushing pawn to a4 and trapping the bishop maybe, or to capture the pawn on h5 with the knight. But both of them are really bad moves, and black can be crushed very quickly, because after knight captures, at first we capture the strong bishop in black's camp, and after king takes, we can simply play pawn to g4 and remove the knight from the h file. After knight to f6, we have queen check, and after king to h8, we can play knight to d5, and remove the knight on f6, and now we can checkmate with queen to h7. So you can see it is very, very difficult for black. Now we look at the better move for black, which is pawn to a4, attacking the bishop on b3. But if he plays this line, we can simply capture the knight on f6. And the better move is to recapture with e5, then we have bishop d5, and he tries to push the pawn, and we have sooner or later an open h-file. And this game can be very exciting for both sides. But white is still a little bit better here. So if he don't recaptures with the e-pawn, maybe he captures with the bishop, because this seems to be logical, because the diagonal for the black square bishop is open here. And I think more players would choose bishop to f6, but this is completely losing move, because now here comes pawn captures on g6, and whenever he tries to capture the bishop or to recapture this pawn, we can simply play queen to h6. And this is completely winning for white. The next variation is not really the best one for black, it's a sideline, but some players try this. And this starts after knight to a5. Then we play king to b1, knight captures, c takes, and then you can see that it is really hard for black to come through here because this pawn and the knight are protecting the a4. He cannot go for a fast attack, and this is the problem for black here. He has to go for a slow attack with a6 and b5, and yes, this is much too slow. I show you how you can attack now. You can just exchange the bishops. After b5, bishop takes, king takes, and we start our own attack with pawn to g4. Then we have maybe b4, you know the best square for the knight is on e2, and then we have maybe a5. Then we're just looking for our own attack with at first knight to the g3. You can also play push immediately pawn to h4. Your opponent can play pawn to h6. This is one of the best moves in this position. And then we run with pawn to h4. Then we have rook to h8, we have pawn to h5, we have pawn to g5. He thinks that he can close the position after this move. This was the purpose behind pawn to h6 before. But we can see that this is not enough to keep all in balance. So we can break through, we can break the pawn chain with pawn to f4. And after the king retreats, this is the best move here. All other moves are very dangerous. So king retreats, we just capture the pawn, and after pawn takes, we have queen captures. After that, he can play rook to c5, which seems to be an active move, but that helps not really much because we can jump in with the knight. We're threatening to get this check and take the rook on h8. So he has to capture with the bishop, and after knight captures, the same threat remains on the board. So he has to do something, rook to g8. But then we can retreat the queen, and we can simply run with our pawns, and we can gain the full point here. So maybe you think why he cannot capture this pawn. That is very simple. Because of this lethal tactic, queen captures on c5, and he cannot recapture because this is a cute checkmate. So you can see how lost this position actually is. Okay, that was all I want to tell you today about the Sicilian Dragon. Let me know if you have some questions to some lines, and I hope I can help you then. So thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye bye.